Hi, folks. You were Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to... What am I going to talk about? I've got a few subjects here, and I've forgotten which one. I better look it up. Changing language. There we go. So language changing, or the use of street talk, jive talk, pidgin English talk, whatever you like, machine talk, as in the way you would text people with abbreviations, and also words of meaning where the meaning may have changed, or even though the words stays the same. So there's a lot of street talk, jive talk. Now, when I very first went to the United States, I was surprised at quite a few of the slang terms on the street. Now, they weren't necessarily in the offices where, at the time when I first started going to the States, certainly in the higher technology industries, it was wall-to-wall white people and nearly all men, so straight white males. But when you get onto the street, and particularly at the sort of, I don't know, the high school kids working at the burger joints or something like that, you would notice a different sort of speak. Now, a different language is equally used by the black people. So, I was out in rural Texas, I think, at one time, and I went into a burger place, and there were only black employees at this place. And actually, no, it was out of suburban Dallas, I think, this place. But anyway, there's only black people working there, and I don't think they'd ever heard a non-American accent previously. And so when I just went and said, oh, yeah, I'll have a burger and fries and I don't know, Coke, whatever it was. And everyone behind the counter sort of stopped and looked around, and they started talking like black slang talk, jive talk amongst themselves. And one of them came forward, I love that, I love that crazy accent, but said in a very black sort of street talk way. And I didn't think that that black street talk was real. I'd seen it in the movies, and I just assumed it was some Hollywood invention, but it actually was real. It did exist. Also rural out in rural Texas, even the white sort of peasant-looking folks out in rural Texas, I had to get my head around. There was we just packed up from a trade show, and the guy was sort of the stand manager putting it. He said, "Look," he said, you may, do you want to see some of rural Texas? Because I'm driving from wherever it was, Dallas to Houston or something like that." He said, "Look, do you want to see some of rural Texas? And why don't you help me pack up the stand, and you can come with me, and I'll show you some of the rolling hills of Texas," and that type of stuff. And so I was going along, and it turns out there was this really bad sort of rainstorm came along, and somehow it affected this truck, or the small truck, and so we ended up stopping at a gas station, and where they had like a mechanic there that came on duty in the morning, and I hadn't sort of understood or realised that this sort of hillbilly type language was out there. So, and I'll try and imitate it here. But the guy's saying that the floorboards of the van are soaking wet. That's floorboards are soaking wet. That was the sort of how it sort of. So I had to listen. What the fuck did he just say? Now, the reverse also was true. I was standing next to the American guy who was doing all the talking. He had quite a Texas drawl himself, but and I would spontaneously said something, and the guy said, he said, "Oh, you were lucky to make it here in this sort of weather," and I just blurted out without thinking, "Yeah, we got right to the top of the hill, and it was then that it happened just as well, because we could coast into the gas station without having to push the thing." And they'd never really heard an accent outside of their own. So sometimes you can get accents that develop from local areas and people who don't move around that much talking to each other, and they can sort of develop an accent, particularly pronunciation and so on, even if words are the same. But I just want to talk about language more differently, particularly how it sort of bifurcates along class and racial lines. Wherever I went into or was near, say, black countries or black areas, whether it be in Africa or elsewhere, I found that the English is pronounced very differently from the way it is in England. Particularly the proper English of say, the Queen's English, if you will, or the King's English. And you look at how English or spoken English developed in, say, the Caribbean. That sort of Rastafarian type thing. And once they start talking amongst themselves, I can barely understand what they're saying. The same could be said, though, for Irish. I was in Ireland doing business once, and the Irish guys were talking to me, and then they would talk amongst themselves, not in Gaelic or anything. It was still English language, but because they slipped into the local brogue, I really struggled to follow what they were saying. Same could be for parts of rural Scotland, or even parts of northern England. Some of the smaller villages around, not far from, say, Sheffield. Trying to listen to follow what they're saying when they're talking between themselves. Or I was in Cornwall, rural Cornwall once, and again, the local people speaking the local sort of Cornish accent, they could understand me okay, but I struggle to understand them. So it's not just a matter of going to other countries. It can be, again, local development of local accents. But in England, at least, if you spoke proper English, you were considered upper class, better educated, all this sort of stuff. Whereas if you spoke a regional accent, you're considered the equivalent of a hillbilly or a lower class, working class person. And this was very much a divide that existed, still exists today to some extent. And so if you look at the World War II propaganda movies, you would hear the officers speaking, very, very, very proper English, whereas the basic soldiers were speaking in regional accents and were considered, as lesser people, in as much as they didn't pronounce words properly. They would drop their H's. Now, if you look at, say, in London, the Cockney accent and then the Cockney subculture language, where they had a strange sort of rhyming slang type thing. So instead of saying, I'm going to go up the stairs, they would say apples and pears. Apples and pears rhymes with stairs. Now, it's an odd way of going about things, you'd think, but this was the Cockney rhyming slang language. So they would then abbreviate that to apples or apps. I'm going to go up the apps, meaning the apples and pears. Or if you're going to buy a suit, it would be a whistle and flute. That would mean rhymed with suit. And or other rhymes that I can't off the top of my head sort of think of. But so this, and then there was other slang words, like instead of clothes, you would say clobber. So I'm going to get some new clobber, and that means I'm going to get some new clothes. And so there's a whole sort of sub-language that existed in the Cockney areas. People didn't move around that much. They were in the same house for 100 years or more. And so they were able to develop this subculture language specific to the subculture. But that sort of paradigm has changed, because the subculture now comes to you via the internet or via your mobile phone and this sort of thing. So the subculture is delivered to you. You don't have to live in a particular area or district. Not that still can't have an effect. It does. For example, the black people hanging out together, they create their own subculture language. And that may, because it's now uncool to be white, but it's cool to be an oppressed sort of black person, then the language that they use gets greater prominence because it's considered to be extra cool, rather than the language of the white people, which is the evil Nazi, fascist oppressor, and so on. So you're getting those sort of things ping-ponging around in the overall architecture of language development. Also, and you look at, say, language developing, for example, in England, the language was sort of various shades of Gaelic, and um, uh, then the Romans came, and Latin became the language of the law, rather not the language of the street, the language of the law. Latin words crept into the Gaelic, or were used, or that words that didn't exist in Gaelic but did in Latin. And given Latin was a language of law and commerce, then they crept into the Gaelic language. So you had that sort of thing. But Latin wasn't the language of the common people. Then there was the Saxon, or the Germanic primarily. Then the Danish, which was again quite a Germanic language, coming into England. Then and you can see that supplanting the Latin Gaelic hybrid language, but this time the language of the Germanic languages, the Angles and the Danes, that did start to permeate the people and the peasants. So language did change substantially there, and because there are written records of language throughout that time, we can see its development and its change. Now remember, there are two changes. On one side, you've got new words coming into the lexicon, but importantly, there was pronunciation changes. For example, in Latin, it used to be that the letter C was hard pronounced as a k. So, for example, Tacitus would be pronounced Tacitus in the old Latin. Now, as in Italian today, there are still many words that emanated from the Latin. Some words are changed. Changed little, if at all. The word for bad in Latin, mali, is still the word mali, from which the English word we get the word malevolent, for example, or malicious, and so on. But the difference in pronunciation is quite noticeable, significant, I would argue, from the Latin of the Roman Empire days to the Italian pronunciation today. So instead of C being a hard C, the k sound, it has the ch sound. So, Tacitus, that sort of thing, or even softer, in the English version of that, Tacitus. So, so pronunciation changes are just as significant as changes of word. Now, there are still, English was a little bit unique in as much as it kept all the languages still going. For example, the English word for shade, as in shade from the sun, comes from the German word Schade. It's pretty much the same, or almost the same spelling. Slightly different, but almost the same spelling. But the pronunciation is different. Instead of Schade, the sound at the end of the E, it's now shade. And you can see this in many other words in English deriving that have been kept from the Saxon language. Now, when the Normans invaded England in 1066, the language of the law, certainly a commerce at the upper end, changed to be French, because the province of Normandy being in France. So this created almost two languages that were running in parallel. The primarily the Germanic language of the people, which still contained some Gaelic and some Latin, but through the French, the Latin was in another way reintroduced into Britain. But if we look at the development of languages, say from the time of Alfred the Great, say 800 AD, and then we see its development going into, say, the time of Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, that sort of stuff, through into the 1700s. And say the word public, for example, as in the public good, that used to contain a CK at the end, but now it's just the C, and the C has got the hard pronunciation. So there are many changes in language and pronunciation, again, not only just words, but pronunciation. But this is a new phenomenon we're in now, is it's not regional or local or requiring a physical invasion or anything like that. It's from mass movement of people with vastly different languages. Most of the people coming into the West, for example, English is not their first language, nor do they have a Western alphabet and concept of language and concept of language structure. They come from vastly different. But on top of that, the simplicity of human interfaces with machine, texting and that sort of stuff, then that type of language has changed, or that has caused different changes in language. But it seems to be doing full circle. The people that don't speak English properly or can't speak English well enough, or maybe they use products like Grammarly or something, so they write in pidgin English and think in pidgin English, but they are able to use Grammarly to turn their pidgin English into acceptable English. And this is why I think for a whole range of like job interviews now, they're insisting that you have to send a video of you have to do a video application, and but even with AI, that's changing. But coming back again to this, that the people that can't speak English and don't want to speak English don't see why they should. They're coming in such numbers into the West that they're still not speaking English. Even people that have been, people that arrived as children, and they come to the West and still at the age of 50 or 60, they can still barely speak a word of English. Then you look at the people who were born from migrant, illegal or otherwise, born from migrant parents in the West. They still speak English with an accent. Look at the amount of Mexicans or South Americans that come to the United States. They're born in the United States. They've been through the whole schooling system, but they still speak English with a heavy South American accent. So I would see there that language is redividing again. I think there was a standard of language. If you meet this standard, then everything is good. And it was a way of achieving common language, and it was a form of equality that could be aspired to. I know people who English people who were born in the regions or the out, and they spoke with a heavy accent. And they went to special elocution schools to get rid of their accent and to speak the king or the queen's English, as it were. And now you can barely pick any accent in them. There's maybe just a slight little sort of Cockney twang or something in there, but barely discernible. So this was a way of achieving or having a goal to achieve. Now it's gone in all directions, and the equality that could have been achieved, I think, has been lost now. And we're going back to a class divide based on language, use of language, pronunciation, and abbreviations, and so on. This can happen quite easily. I think it was 1812 or 1815, something like that. In Australia, there was some concern expressed that the people that were, the children born in the Australian colonies, then the colony of Old Sydney Town or New South Wales, that those children were developing strange accents and strange manners and habits. They weren't respecting authority along the feudal aristocratic lines that they're required to in Britain. Doffing their hats and bowing their heads, and it was considered to be that the lower classes didn't look at an aristocrat. They would look at the floor and act all humble and servile. But they weren't doing that in Australia, and this was considered to be a problem. How is this happening? Why is it happening? What are the causes? So they actually the British government actually sent a commissioner out, Commissioner Bigge, Bigge, to find out what's going on. And he expressed, his reports expressed considerable alarm that he addressed some children who were swimming in the off one of the beaches in Sydney or one of the streams or something like that. And he addressed them, and they were quite casual about it. Hey, buddy, how you doing? Good day, is it? And he was concerned by this. Why weren't they showing the proper respect? Why weren't they talking in the proper working class accent? And a new accent was developing already, even in that short time, in Australia, and this was considered to be a problem. So when we look at language and accents and so on changing, is it changing? Well, sure it is, but it's changing in a way that we haven't seen before, especially the human to machine type level of interaction and the mass migration interaction, creating subculture languages, in the countries they arrive. For example, there are people that have come to Australia as children, like one from like Vietnam I'm thinking of now, where they go back to visit their relatives in Vietnam. They still consider themselves Vietnamese, even though they're born in Australia, as most third world migrants do, by the way. Even Indians, 5 generations on, they still claim they're Indian. So they go, but they still speak Vietnamese. But the Vietnamese back in Vietnam laugh at them because they've got this weird sounding Vietnamese with strange words, Western words popping in here and there, that English words and so on. So already there's a Vietnamese subculture language in Australia, and I'm sure elsewhere around the world. So this is, I think, is going to create, has already, is going to redivide us all along class lines in ways that we hadn't previously anticipated. And if you add in robotics and AI, then we're off on an adventure where we can barely decide what the outcome's going to be. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.